Welcome to Chrissy's Corner True Crime Podcast. This is episode number 2 of my serial killer series. In this episode, we will explore the life and many crimes of serial killer Elias Abuelazam, otherwise known as the Flint serial slasher. In the summer of 2010, the community of Flint, Michigan was stalked by a knife-wielding man who focused his murderous rage primarily on black men in the community. When he was taken into custody, he left more than a dozen gravely injured men and 5 deaths in his wake. Elias was born into a well-off Arab Christian family in Ramla, Israel, and the family relocated to America when he was a young child. His mother had married again and managed to obtain a green card, but she was never granted citizenship. The people of his hometown did not have good things to say about him. He was described as a young man who used drugs, got into fights, and had unsteady employment. At 20 years old, he decided to leave Israel due to the arrests for drugs and violence. So in 1995, seeking a fresh start with relatives, he moved to the United States. He also would receive a green card, but never became a U.S. citizen. Abuelazam spent some time working as a mental health technician at the Piedmont Behavioral Health Center in Leesburg, Virginia, now known as North Spring Behavioral Health Care. His co-workers described him as a gentle giant, a man who displayed remarkable patience and restraint when dealing with mentally unstable and violent teenagers. They would brag about how he diffused situations where it would be easy for the 6'5", 280-pound man to physically subdue the child. He worked there until 2008, and it is the experience that may have given him the idea to plead insanity when he was later arrested and charged with murder. In 1997, Elias married Dawn Costello. They would separate in 2000 and be officially divorced in 2002. Not much is known about their relationship. On July 30th, 2004, Abuelazam married Jessica Hirth, but this marriage also did not last long. They divorced in 2007, and Jessica's parents were later shocked by his criminal activities. Her mother thought he was a nice man. Jessica's father, however, claimed Abuelazam was abusive towards his wife, and that's why she divorced him. Like much of his life before his crimes, not much is known about Elias' time after his divorce and what he did before moving to Michigan. Just the occasional report from a former co-worker and what was documented in divorce proceedings. While Elias was in the United States for more than a decade before his murderous spree, it was when he settled in Michigan again, staying with family, that he would reveal himself to be a terribly violent man. On May 22, 2010, Elias moved to a home in Flint, Michigan that was owned by his uncle. His uncle not only found him a place to live, but helped him secure a job at the nearby convenience store. The crimes Abuelazam committed and is suspected of committing took place between the months of May and August of 2010. It is alleged he would drive his Chevy Trailblazer around at night and target small-statured men who happened to be alone. Abuelazam would come up with a ruse such as needing directions for help with his vehicle, and then he would stab them. Aiming mainly for the stomach and chest, the majority of his victims were black, so authorities suspected the attacks were motivated by a racial hatred. His first victim, David Motley, a 31-year-old African-American man, was stabbed and lying in a front yard on May 24, 2010. Despite EMT's efforts to revive him, Motley was pronounced dead at the scene. There were no witnesses to his murder, so it was written off as another random act of violence in a city already struggling. Motley became one of 53 people killed that year. It wouldn't take too long before the police realized this murder wasn't just some random act. They would discover this was just the beginning of Elias's spree that would leave an additional 4 men dead and 13 others injured. By August 4, 2010, it was clear that the large number of stabbings had occurred since May were likely the actions of one perpetrator. A task force was created to investigate the crimes. Within a few days, the Leesburg police were able to connect 3 attacks on black men in their area as the work of one man. Descriptions of the suspect had been given by the victims, and video surveillance footage of each attack was located and analyzed. The police were in the process of narrowing down their suspects when Abuelazam, who was on vacation visiting relatives, happened to get arrested on August 5th in Arlington, Virginia. During a routine traffic stop, he was found to have outstanding warrant for a previous assault. During the routine search of his vehicle, police found a knife and a hammer, which both were returned to him along with his car. They had no idea the items would later be linked to the murders. Though he was released on bond, his information was entered into the system, and police were able to piece the puzzle together and identify him as their main suspect. The police released a description of Abuelazam, a description of his vehicle, and a few details of the cases to the public in hopes that someone would call in with information leading to his arrest. The tips came pouring in, and tip number 314 came from a lady that had stated he looked like a man her father works with named Elias Abuelazam. An arrest warrant was issued after checking out his whereabouts during the murders and other attacks. The information made Elias aware that they were onto him, and he attempted to run. On August 11, 2010, Abuelazam was arrested at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as he waited to board a flight to Tel Aviv. He was given the option to appeal extradition to Michigan, which he declined. He was therefore transported to Flint, Michigan on August 26th. He was originally charged with 3 open counts of murder and 6 counts of assault with the intent to commit murder. Because of the nature of his alleged crimes, he was held without bond and placed in solitary confinement while he awaited his trial. Prosecutors decided to move forward on the charges for murder of the 49-year-old Arnold Minor, but decided not to go forth with the other charges until a later time. The first trial began May 8, 2012 for Arnold Minor murder, which took place in Michigan before Abuelazam had gone on vacation. In an unusual turn of events, the judge allowed evidence from other cases to be submitted during this trial. One important piece of evidence was a blood drop found on Abuelazam's pants, which was found to belong to Arnold Minor. 50 witnesses were called by the prosecution, including an uncle of Abuelazam, who had assisted in the arrest. Faced with an overwhelming amount of evidence, the defense team put forward a plea of insanity. Only one expert witness testified regarding Abuelazam's mental state, and the credibility of this psychiatrist was questioned by the prosecution, specifically because his doctor's expertise was in drug and alcohol addiction, not mental illness. 2 psychologists were brought forward by the prosecution who claimed that although Abuelazam likely suffered from some sort of personality disorder, there was no evidence that he was insane at the time of the murders. Abuelazam did not fit the legal criteria of insanity plea. The jury began their deliberations on May 22, 2012, and just 1 hour later, they had made their decision. They found Abuelazam guilty of the murder of Arnold Minor. Michigan does not have the death penalty, so he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After his sentencing, the judge dismissed the other 10 charges against him without prejudice, meaning they could reissue them if needed. A man who held an entire city of terror for months, a man labeled as the Flint serial slasher, was off the streets. While crime continued to be an issue in Flint, and is still an issue today, the people were able to breathe a little easier with him off the street. Since being sentenced to a life in prison on June 25, 2012, things have not been quiet for Abuelazam. Before his trial in November 2010, he was arraigned on 5 counts of assaulting a police officer after attacking a prison guard. After he was sentenced in June 2014, his conviction was upheld. 2 months later, Elias sued the federal government. He wanted to go home to Israel. He felt he had grounds for transfer since back in 2009, Elias stabbed a friend before he came to Flint. What he really wanted was to go to Israel prison to serve out his sentence, but the request was denied. Abuelazam was not a U.S. citizen, and he felt his status as an Israeli should offer him some advantages. He thought by returning to the country of his birth, he would serve less time behind bars. He continued to file appeals, but in November of 2014, the Michigan Supreme Court declined to hear his case. In May 2017, a story in the Loudoun Times newspaper, attorney for the Commonwealth of Virginia James Plowman noted that Abuelazam's motives were based on paranoia and delusion. Despite having to confess to the attack in Israel and the murder in Virginia, Elias has never explained his stabbing spree in the summer of 2010. Some investigators have drawn conclusions based on the fact that 16 of his victims were Black, while one was Hispanic, and one was white. Did Elias have a fixation on the hatred for blacks and minorities? Others say, despite his victims' profiles, we cannot assume his motivations. As of right now, Elias Abuelazam is 43 years old and resides at the Brooksville Correctional Facility in Muskegon on the western side of the state. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Please consider giving it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes.